right, so today we have Dan Schwarz, CEO and co-founder of Futuresearch, which you can read about at futuresearch.ai. Guest tagline is hard questions answered correctly. So Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Ben.
And today the occasion of this conversation is around some recent studies you had about OpenAI's revenue, which is considered, I guess, OpenAI is one of these bellwether companies in the generative AI space,
That's right.
having basically launched the category with ChatGPT. So I guess before we drill down into the minutia and details of the study, give our audience kind of the top line, and then we'll dive in, and then I'll ask you follow-up questions. Just the headline. What would be the headline?
Absolutely. So my company, Futuresearch, was the first last summer to figure out where some of OpenAI's revenues were coming from back before those numbers were known. And we've been tracking this for the last year or so. There's been some very misleading news reports, and most recently, there's been some news from OpenAI itself about their own projections. And since we've been tracking this, we can kind of calibrate them against our expert forecasts, and we find some of it credible and some of it not credible. Generally speaking, the new headline number from OpenAI themselves, 125 billion in revenue by 2029, while plausible, is a bit incredulous. And I want to kind of make the case to you today that that's implausible. Some of our analysis also ties into this report that came out a couple weeks ago called AI 2027. Not sure if your listeners have read it. Have you read it, Ben?
No.
I highly encourage you and your listeners and readers. It's AI2027.com. You'll find it immediately. It was covered in the New York Times. It's a scenario laid out where a frontier lab has a runaway AI takeoff. And it is based on a particular type of R&D set of progress that is based on a certain amount of revenue. And so Futuresearch went in and looked and said, is that revenue plausible? And so that's where a lot of our analysis comes from. If OpenAI really has this exponential revenue growing all the way to 100 billion or 125 billion, how exactly is that going to work?
I see. Right. So my impression of OpenAI vis-a-vis, for example, Anthropic, right? So Anthropic revenue is mainly through API, mainly through AWS. OpenAI has a bit more healthy mix between API and consumer, but skews more consumer. Is this a fair assessment?
Yes, that's correct. But what's interesting is last year around this time, this was not well known. A lot of people thought OpenAI was making most of its revenue from the API. And we showed that it certainly was no more than 15% of their revenue, that ChatGPT was the dominant source of revenue for them as of mid-2024. And then ChatGPT Enterprise was starting to grow substantially. And that is still the case today. And part of their own projections is that they expect to make many billions in API revenue. And I'm fairly skeptical of that for reasons that we can get into. Their own projections involve ChatGPT continuing to be a consumer behemoth, one of the most revenue-generating consumer products of all time, if not the single number one, not to mention enterprise and then kind of other businesses, which I'm sure we'll get to later in the podcast.
So you threw out a number, 125 billion by 2029, which is OpenAI's own projection.
That's right.
Do you and you kind of questioned that. So do you offer an alternative revenue projection?
We do. Our confidence intervals are kind of wide, and we focused on the year 2027. One of the things about forecasting, which, this is a data podcast, I think you will kind of understand the time series world.
I'm a former hedge fund quant.
Then you probably understand better than I do. But the farther you go in the future, the more fuzzy things look. When we were forecasting revenue in 2027, we found this quite challenging because there's a lot of sources of uncertainty, which I'd be happy to get into right now. Our 1090 confidence interval for revenue in 2027 was something like 10 to 90 billion. That's a very, very large range. We basically found it's one of the most uncertain businesses that it's possible to forecast because rapid exponential growth, basically they are a monopoly and they monopolize multiple industries, is in fact plausible. It's not likely, but it's plausible. But also them massively stumbling, due to ongoing litigation and the talent exodus, and mostly just competition from other labs that already have better models in some categories in OpenAI, could really prevent them from having this kind of exponential revenue takeoff.
So Obviously, you use statistical models to do this kind of confidence interval of 10 to 90 billion by 2027, right? So, but what are what are some of the data sources that you rely on?
Yeah. I think a good forecast is always some sort of data extrapolation and then adjusted for the factors that aren't captured in the data. At Futuresearch, we specialize in judgmental forecasting, the types of tournaments that, Phil Tetlock was running against the CIA, kind of the way prediction markets can work, where you can ask questions for which there really is no relevant data at all. So, for example, if you ask something like, will Elon Musk win his lawsuit against Sam Altman? There's not really time series data that backs that. You can look at previous lawsuits. You could look at lawsuits from OpenAI or from Elon Musk. You could look at tech lawsuits or fair use or nonprofit lawsuits and try to construct some sort of data set from which you could extrapolate. But quite often, those data sets are very limited. It gives you nothing more than kind of a crude base rate, and then you have to apply your judgment. To the extent that you have a statistical forecast and you're extrapolating, you get these pretty tight confidence intervals. We, in this case, are very wide in our confidence intervals because we don't think the extrapolation from the existing data is that great. Without kind of saying a bunch of numbers that will be hard for your listeners to follow, the kind of the baseline extrapolation, it goes from 1 billion in revenue up to like 3.5 or 3.7 billion in revenue over a year. And you just connect those two data points and draw an exponential curve. That's an extremely crude baseline to anchor to. It may not even be exponential at all, or it could be very super exponential. So the main thing is tracking competition. And if you look at competition, you get all sorts of interesting numbers, real stats that you can anchor yourself to. For example, how good are OpenAI's models? This is a very hard question to answer because there are many benchmarks that are changing all the time. They're measuring different things, and those benchmarks are, they're not necessarily consistent with the actual user experience. So someone might go to ChatGPT versus Claude versus Grok versus Gemini because the model is better for some use case which is not being measured by some benchmark. Maybe they really like it as a therapist, or maybe they like it for, quant use cases. And if there's no benchmark tracking that, it's hard to say what's better and what's worse. So we can use that data to ground ourselves and say, do we think OpenAI actually is in the lead with their models? But you have to use a lot of judgment too. Like, what would cause somebody to switch from ChatGPT to Claude, for example?
Yeah, at this point, full disclosure, I use a bunch of these models on a regular basis through their APIs and through their chat interface, right? So the Llama models, the OpenAI models, Claude, Gemini, DeepSeek, and I don't know if OpenAI is head and shoulders above. So from a pure, are they way ahead of the competition? The answer in my mind is a resounding no. So it really comes down to what's your use case? Can you tune it? What's the cost, latency that you're willing to tolerate, right? So if it's a reasoning model, is it more cheaper to use an alternative and so on and so forth? Set that aside. So let's go back to your 2027 forecast. Do you have by 2027, what's the revenue mix between API and consumer?
Yeah, so I'll give you basically the most optimistic scenario. And I think that's the scenario I want to give you because it is in line with OpenAI's own projections and what you will read in the media. And I will try to explain how those numbers could come to be. Our actual forecasted numbers are a little bit more complicated, and it's going to be hard to kind of rattle them off in this call. So I'll kind of give you the optimistic take. I'll also say one more thing before I answer that, which is another data source that is kind of surprising, but I think useful in this case is how fast do companies generally grow? And in this case, the question we asked ourselves is how long does it generally take the most successful companies to get to 10 billion in revenue and then 100 billion in revenue? And if you check this, it actually has kind of a nice power law to it. We're not a power law, but like an exponential curve that you can extrapolate. And I have some of the numbers here.
It's a great chart that you guys produced. Yeah.
Yeah, because the trend was so straightforward, and that gave us some confidence that it was telling us something. So Microsoft took 28 years to reach 100 billion in revenue. Amazon took 18 years. Google took 14 years. Facebook took 11 years, and ByteDance took 6 years. And if you just model it as a 40% reduction, basically decade over decade, you actually get to OpenAI, assuming it is the number one fastest growing company of its decade, which is plausible, could actually achieve it in as little as 4 years. And that would be in line with their own projections in the AI 2027 scenario. But yeah, let me answer your question about what the breakdown is. So I guess my headline takeaway is that I don't really believe in ChatGPT. ChatGPT probably faces the most competitive pressure. As you just said, Ben, lots of us are using Claude and DeepSeek and Gemini and all these other models.
And by the way, since you and I are both here in Silicon Valley, the biggest open secret is Zuckerberg and Meta. They're aiming squarely for
Yep.
ChatGPT with Meta, the Meta.ai, right? So,
Yeah, he wants to make it a, open source commodity, basically erasing anybody having profit margins there.
and
And,
by the way, Gemini on my iPhone is essentially free and quite good, multimodal, right? So.
exactly. I think I think Meta is a sleeping giant, but Google is maybe, it's not really a sleeping giant, but just a real giant.
Well, I mean, Google has the distribution through Android, and now it seems like they're in the mix with the iPhone. And Meta has the advantage that the CEO controls all the voting power, so he can basically change direction. If we want to aim at ChatGPT, we're going to aim at ChatGPT.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Google, of course, and I mean Meta as well. They have their war chest. OpenAI has had to raise truly stupendous amounts of venture capital in order to even get this far. Compared to other hyperscaling businesses that we know, if you think about the Googles and the Facebooks, their operating costs were quite low. Like, they talked about zero marginal cost for an additional user, an additional click. OpenAI is spending billions and billions to provide their service. So that's another advantage of making
Every time you use ChatGPT, they're losing money.
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends how you're using it. But exactly, Google would quite plausibly give away Gemini 2.5 Pro plus the search and the deep research, the canvas, the image, the audio models for free if it was in their interests. And it's hard for me to believe that ChatGPT for $20 a month can compete with that.
And by the way, it's not just the ongoing inference cost, it's the cost that you have to bear in order to release models on a regular cadence just to make sure you're in the mix in the conversation, right?
That's
Because
right.
look, not only is Google now releasing models on a regular cadence, both Gemini and Gemma, DeepSeek is releasing models on a regular basis.
That's
Uh,
right.
Now, Meta, I think, could increase their cadence, and they might now that Zuck is fully focused on this. So now there's pressure for you to release models on a regular cadence, which means training.
That's right. Yeah, it is unbelievably expensive what OpenAI is going to have to do. Now, it does seem like they've built enough of a war chest to survive this portion of it, but they're going to have to raise even more if they're going to hit these targets. And it's not clear whether they're going to be able to do that. They're very dependent on SoftBank. SoftBank is becoming their customer. So they're kind of like a customer investor blend, which compounds their risk if it turns sour in that relationship. They could lose both revenue from a customer and they could lose investment from an investor. But yeah, so if ChatGPT is going to be fiercely competitive, Meta and Google are aiming at them, like, it already might be the case that a $0 a month thing is better than the $20 a month thing. It's hard to imagine how they're going to get, say, 10, 50 million people to pay for that on the regular when people can switch to a free provider. So then the big question is, where would all of this revenue come from? And I do think it's plausible that OpenAI will tap into vast amounts of revenue. I just don't think it's going to come from ChatGPT or the
So
API.
do we know how many people are paying for ChatGPT?
I have some numbers that are a little bit out of date. We get, these updates relatively infrequently when there's some sort of insider leak. That was part of last summer why we were the first one to actually figure out what this number was, because we were able to kind of deduce it from the other numbers that were known out there. That number was later verified by a release that came from OpenAI in September of last year. I think the estimates now are something like 23 million, but I actually don't have them in front of me, so I shouldn't quote that right now. No, I think that's right. I think it's 23 million paying subscribers to ChatGPT as of April of this year. So last
And
month.
then we also know the churn is insane, right?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, a lot of people I know have canceled their subscriptions exactly because the free tiers from the other offerings are as good. But let me try to answer your question from earlier is where's that revenue going to come from? So this is kind of the double think or the juxtaposition that I think it's very important for anybody in this industry to hold in your head.
Oh, wait, before you proceed, Dan. So if 23 million paid subscribers to ChatGPT right now, do we know anything about the revenue from API as of now?
Yes.
By the way, API is also kind of a race to the bottom, right?
Yeah, I don't believe in the API.
And so Anthropic in many ways is in bigger trouble than OpenAI.
I mean, the point is that it's very competitive. So unless somebody can demonstrate something that is clearly better, and Google again here is kind of I mean, I worked at Google for many years, so I'm somewhat biased, but I watched them kind of losing the AI race for years, and then they kind of caught up. But if you look at these charts, again, it's hard to describe over a podcast, but in written, people can see the
But
materials.
then you also have the open weights models. There's so many endpoints. It's so cheap, right?
That's right. And so
Right.
the question here is, what is the frontier of quality for cost?
Yeah.
And it seems like Google is really winning this one. If you want to pay for the very best reasoning model, yeah, it's slow, it's expensive, it's rate limited. But for most people who are using the API, like my company Futuresearch, which spends thousands of dollars a month on many of these different providers, we're seeing that our money is stopping going to OpenAI and starting to go to Google and to Anthropic. And yeah, customers can change on a dime. Like the moment that there's a better model, it's so easy for them to stop spending even huge amounts of money on
Yeah,
one provider.
honestly, anyone working on AI should do that, right? So design
Yep,
your system so they're model agnostic, and maybe you're even using multiple models from different providers, right? Never tie yourself to one provider, right?
that's right. I mean, for myself and many other folks who were entirely dependent on the OpenAI APIs when they were the only game in town, even then we were already preparing to diversify away. And when those other models became available, we rapidly did so. So the idea that API revenue for them is going to grow exponentially into this, $10 billion behemoth is very implausible to me.
But wait, Dan, agents. They're talking about
Agents.
agents to
Yes.
OpenAI is like robots and self-driving cars to Tesla.
Right, right. Well, I mean, I worked at Waymo for 1 year in 2019, and so I worked on the self-driving car. Now, the one that you see all over San
Yeah,
Francisco.
yeah, no, Waymo is real, right? So, but
Yes.
the
Yeah.
Tesla camera only, I don't buy it, right? So,
Well, that's why I think your parallel, Ben, to self-driving cars is so great because we have the example of the kind of vaporware version, the FSD from Tesla that never really materialized, and then the real one from Waymo. And so you can look and see both, yes, it is possible to achieve like a massive technological breakthrough and automate an entire job that previously is done by millions of people for billions of dollars a year. But it's also possible that those projections just peter out and lead nowhere. Even Waymo, which is now doing very well as of 2025. When I worked there in 2019, they were already 5 years behind schedule. People were leaving the company. It was kind of tense as they were trying to meet their own deadlines. They
but
did eventually get there, but it took way longer.
they have certain advantages. They use the same car, so the geometry is fixed.
Hmm.
Um, and they restrict themselves to certain geographies
Hmm.
where they can operate safely.
That's
But
right.
until they publish what is the operator to car ratio, we don't actually know if they're how much money they're losing, right? So, and
Yeah, the cars are very expensive, and you're right. They've got their guardian angels that are sitting there in their operating centers ready to take over if the cars get in trouble, and those people have wages as well.
so
Yeah.
so anyway, so if Dan, now if you talk to OpenAI execs, and I know some of them, so I hope they're not listening to this, but it's all about agents, man.
That's right.
So yeah, we're all building these agents, and enterprise subscribers will pay $200 per seat for these agents that will automate, whole jobs, right? So,
Well, one quick caveat, because I think that's the main meat of this discussion. In their revised projections about why they thought they could reach 125 billion revenue in 2029, better than their 100 billion that they had earlier, a lot of that difference was explained in, quote, new products, including free user monetization. And maybe you've seen some of these announcements. Sam Altman has been talking about starting a social network. He wants
oh
to
yeah.
compete in search and advertising. He wants to build product search. And honestly, it seems like OpenAI is considering every model.
Train models on a regular basis. So so he's going to have to hire all these people.
Yeah, I think the technology really is revolutionary. So I think it's not crazy for them to consider basically every single scaled internet business model and see which one of those their technological advantages could lead them to. But again, most companies that are on this exponential revenue growth, they're not looking for brand new markets. When Google Ads was starting to make billions and billions, they weren't stopping and thinking, where's the rest of our revenue going to come from? They were just trying to scale that. And with Facebook with their ad revenue, Amazon, Microsoft, any of these guys, when their exponential revenue took off, they doubled down on their core business. They didn't then pivot to something else. Sam Altman and OpenAI saying, hey, maybe we'll start doing, advertising, or maybe we'll start doing social, or we'll start doing product, or they'll build hardware devices or other things they've talked about. That to me is not the talk of somebody who believes that they're going to have continued exponential growth of their existing business model. So I just want to say that, there's now this, thing on their chart, 25 billion from other revenue. I'm very skeptical that any of those are going to work out, that they're going to be able to compete in
So
social.
other revenue is completely different from API and consumer.
That's right. So they have consumer, enterprise, API, this thing called free user monetization that I don't believe in at all. And then agents. Yeah. So getting back to your question about agents, this is the only source of really scaled revenue that I think is really credible. I and my forecasters and our statistical analysis indicate it is definitely possible. If it's not likely, but I could actually see them reaching their goals via some sort of agent-based revenue business.
But on the agent-based revenue, right? So the agent-based revenue, I guess there's two main components there. Obviously, breakthroughs in foundation models,
Mhm.
of which it's not clear that they are head and shoulders above.
That's right.
Breakthroughs in developer experience and UX,
Mhm.
right? Because basically, these agents will need to, developers will need to be able to build these agents, and then there should be the user experience that allows knowledge workers to work with these agents and manage fleets of these agents.
That's right.
It's not clear any of those are moats.
Yes. Yeah. So when you're talking about a moat, we're talking about competition. I think that this scenario where this revenue takes off is predicated on OpenAI having a technical lead in specifically agents. They may not have the best foundational model anymore, but I think the release of O3 and O4 Mini at least gives a credible chance that they can produce agents that are simply more capable. And one of the funny things about, people talk
So,
about,
so wait, before you
yeah,
continue. So back up that claim, back up that last claim, man.
yeah.
The
We actually at
O3 and
Futuresearch.
O4 give them give them credibility that they can produce agents that are head and shoulders above everyone else.
Yes. Again,
Why?
I wouldn't say it's likely, but I think it is plausible. And we have some internal evals, and we're actually publishing a paper within a few days. So you want to see the data, we'll have a ton of data coming out that your listeners and viewers and readers can see. O3 does seem to be a step function improvement in web research agentic flows. And web research is a very core part of being an agent. I mean, really, that's what
Right, so
ChatGPT.
this is what people are calling deep research, basically, right?
Not exactly. One of the surprising findings from our paper is that if you go to ChatGPT and you select O3 and you just leave search on, but you do not click deep research, you actually get more accurate results than if you put on deep research.
And is this so? So I guess my question to you is this basically a UX advantage right now? Because Google's UX is worse. So why does this imply the underlying model is better than what Google has?
Well, our evals, we generally use these things over the API and we
Mhm.
use them with the best tools available. So we're kind of holding the tool use and we're holding the UX constant and
Okay.
saying, does just the raw intelligence of the model and checking things like how often does it hallucinate, how gullible it is, what types of reasoning mistakes does it make? And O3 shot to the top of our leaderboards ahead of Gemini 2.5 Pro, ahead of any of the other models that might be competitive.
For
Now,
how long?
again, a
For how
small,
long? For how long?
right. So, so basically, when O1 came out, O1 preview came out in September of 2024. That was the first thinking model that got people very excited about post-training, and people have been talking about that incessantly since some months since. When we evaluated that model, we actually did not find it to be better than the best Sonnet model at these types of web research tasks. And again, by web research, I mean you're answering some tricky question like compile a data set of stocks for this company and find their margins and things like that, and you have to do lots of searches, read lots of
Right.
pages, put it together, do the statistical analysis, all that stuff, and get it all correct. So these are very challenging agentic tasks that even an intelligent human would struggle with. It would take them at least probably an hour to get right. We found that O1 was not actually better than the best Sonnet model. People got very excited about it. And so I had some skepticism that O3 would be as good as people say. But now that it's out, I mean, it was many months delayed from when they first announced it back in December. It does seem to be the best at powering these types of agents to do these very tricky tasks that involve judgment and reasoning and involve many steps. But as you say, that's a very recent edge. As of a month ago, they were behind. And next month, they might again be behind. It's not clear that they have
And by the way, set aside Google. I mean, I'm sure the Chinese, DeepSeek, and all these people are looking at this and going, let's see if we can better this model, right?
There's no question that they're trying. We did evaluate R1 on web research stuff, which again, I still think is the best way of capturing how good an actual agent is. It was performing very, very badly, but R2 is going to come out allegedly is within a couple of days, and we'll eval it through this framework as well and get another sense. And again, we're not the only ones with the benchmark for agents. Web research, though, is just one of the most economically productive things. Like you said, you were a quant. Any sort of like financial analysis where you have to like go dredge up a bunch of data, put it together, and then find some sort of pattern in there. That's mostly just finding stuff on the web and in data tables, compiling it, doing statistical analysis. That's what we're measuring. I think coding agents are another major source of data. Yeah, again, for your forecast, you want to extrapolate some trend. I think
coding, they're clearly not the best.
I'm actually not sure on this one. Myself and my team, we were absolutely in love with Claude, as many other software engineers have been for coding. And then Gemini 2.5 Pro came out. It's not clear. That might be the best coding model. O3 might still be a very good coding model. People are saying it makes up a lot of stuff and kind of cheats on some of the tasks. We don't have evals for that, so I'm not the right person to speak to this.
But I guess then the theme of what this discussion so far is that any kind of advantage, perceived advantage, we're not clear that that's a lasting advantage.
Yes, I would completely agree with that.
Right.
Yeah.
So how do you, so from a revenue perspective, then, if you're not clear it's a lasting advantage, how do you factor that into your forecast?
I will say personally that, I give a very wide range for 2027 revenue. I myself am probably the most bearish on OpenAI of anybody at Futuresearch, because it's exactly what you say, Ben. Like, I don't see an enduring advantage. And the kind of exponential growth, as I said before, for them to reach this 2027 milestone of that trend extrapolation of being 40% faster than the next fastest company to ever reach 100 billion in revenue. Any company that looks anything like that needs to look like a giant monopoly. I mean, the last one was ByteDance, and think about TikTok. It needs to be something that is so utterly dominant that consumers don't even think about using something else. Think about Microsoft Office back in the 1990s. Absolutely no competitor whatsoever. Think about Windows. Think about Google Ads, and think about the ad market. Think about Facebook and social networking. Think about, Amazon. These companies were utterly, utterly dominant in their categories. So OpenAI would have to be utterly dominant in some category. Now, they were dominant in their category of LLMs for about a year and a half. Like, they were the only game in town until Claude 3 eventually came out. Now it's very competitive. But, they've got a great staff. People, at Futuresearch think it's quite plausible that they do reach this big technological lead. But you're right, Ben, there's no clear data that suggests that OpenAI will have this kind of monopolistic power over any of their businesses. Agents, API, chat, enterprise. They're going to need to act monopolistic in one of those categories for this to work. And I personally would agree with you. I think it's below 50% chance that they act like a monopoly in any of those categories, let alone multiple of them as they're projecting.
By the way, so one category of capability where I'm not clear that they're that good is multimodality. I think Gemini is better at multimodal tasks. What's your sense?
I'm not an expert in this. I think that's true, but
which seems like something that an agent and a knowledge worker agent would have to be good at, right? So reasoning, multimodality, planning, these kinds of things.
I will say in our web research agents, being able to work with images on the web is extremely important. Like, if you see a data table or an infographic, you need to be able to read it and get the data out of it. You can't always just download it as a CSV or an Excel file, or just get the raw HTML with all the numbers. And so we frequently in our web agents have to take a screenshot and then interpret what's there. In terms of generating images, I mean, maybe Sora is a good example. OpenAI was very big on video last year.
making sense of different modalities, right? So video, audio, because it's not a question of just, can I transcribe? Because there's a lot of information in video that's not transcribable, or in audio, the tone of the voice is not transcribable, right? So
I totally agree with you. So for example, take customer service, which is kind of the biggest example of agents that we currently have. You can imagine the best customer service agent would be able to get on a call with somebody, talk and listen. That's very difficult. And also get on a video call and look and act. And there's no reason to think that OpenAI is going to be particular. I mean, I'm not sure any AI system is good enough to do that right now, but certainly OpenAI can't credibly claim to be the best at that. I think you're right that Google is better at multimodal. And maybe Meta or someone else will be better at that as well. So you have to be thinking about kind of narrower things. And coding is a good example. You can be very good at coding without multimodal capabilities. And coding is a gigantic, trillion-dollar market. So if they can make, armies of superhuman coders, they could take that all the way to the bank, even without being good multimodal. But then you're focusing on that narrow hypothesis. And again, they're not the best at coding, as you were saying earlier, Ben. So what is it that they're the best at that they can, take to that scale? It might turn out that they'll be very good at multimodal. It might turn out they'll be very good at coding. And it might turn out they'll be very good at, scientific research. That's what Sam Altman was saying, these $20,000 a month armies of PhDs. People like to call them geniuses in data centers. This could happen. But, what is the evidence that OpenAI is actually better at research, R&D? Like, would you pay $20,000 a month for an OpenAI model to, for example, try to discover new drugs for a pharmaceutical company?
Oh, I think
Right now, no.
yeah, I think in that area, I would submit that DeepMind might have a better shot because basically they're interested in that stuff, right? So protein folding
That's right.
and drug discovery and all of these things. So one category of growth that we haven't discussed, and maybe OpenAI is not that interested in it, is physical tasks, robotics.
Yeah.
So it seems like that's going to be huge as well. But obviously, there's other players there, right? So I think Google plays in this space as well.
Google has a very mixed reputation. I worked at Google from 2014 to 2022, and I said I worked at Waymo for one of those years in 2019. Google was very early. When I was at Waymo, I was in the Google X building where just as you're kind of walking to your desk past the coffee machine, there's a giant row of robotic arms that are constantly setting down things and picking them up and setting them down and picking them up. There were just, laser equipment all over the building. They have built little robots that can, roll around and try to get you a drink from the fridge. And then, of course, they built a self-driving car.
But they at least have teams working on this, right?
Yes, but they've had teams working on this for a long time. And also Meta significantly staffed up their internal robotics effort and has basically nothing to show for it. So, Google
enough that in the last 60 Minutes interview, Demis highlighted some of the robotics work that they're doing. So at least they're interested in it. Has OpenAI signaled anything in the robotics front?
It's funny. I've only been to OpenAI in person once, and this was back, I believe, in 2018. And at that time, this is pre.
They were still here, down here in the Mission.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. That's where I was. I was just there for
a few blocks from my house. Yeah.
Oh, really? Yeah. I guess I walked right by your house, Ben, when I walked there.
And now the occupant is X.AI.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah. I wonder how Elon Musk feels about that.
Well, no, Elon was the person paying the rent, and then he stopped paying the rent, so they moved out, and then X.AI.
Oh, that's very funny. Yeah. But yeah, I will say in 2018, I think they were quite serious about this, and they were thinking about all these different applications. Because, back then, reinforcement learning was the very hot topic. Yeah. Google's failures with Boston Dynamics and Boston Dynamics' failure to produce any sort of commercial robot of any value is a big indicator. I've also looked briefly into warehouse automation because, the one place where you think you could make billions of dollars very quickly would be in automating, warehouses. And especially like, manufacturing that is already mostly automated, things like car manufacturing. And I think every single person who's involved in robotics and warehouses and in manufacturing is bitterly disappointed in the progress of the last decade. Everybody thought that these things would be big. Amazon has a little bit of this going, but it's still vast armies of humans doing almost everything. Even just the basic stuff of getting your self-driving forklift to go to the right parcel, pick it up and put it somewhere else is basically still on the frontier of what robotics can do. Now, when Demis, talks about that stuff, is he sitting on some breakthroughs? Is there something about transformers or something about modern generative AI that will break, robotics wide open? Quite possibly. I'm not an expert. I don't understand robotics very well. All I know is that it's been failure after failure, and the rest of Gen AI is quite real. We're using it every day. It's powerful. It's useful. It's worth billions of dollars. Robotics is entirely a future thing. Like it might turn out that that's the next frontier for AI, or we might have another decade of bitter disappointment.
So the OpenAI, the company projects 125 billion by 2029.
That's right.
You are saying it's more likely to be somewhere between 10 and 90 billion by 2027. So set aside the 2029.
Yeah, and again, this is from kind of the aggregate of Futuresearch's internal research and researchers, and I myself am on the lower end of that.
So your 10 to 90 million, right? So
billion.
obviously,
Yeah.
as you mentioned, Sam Altman talks about API, consumer, enterprise. What's the other one?
What he calls new products.
New
So
products.
basically
So
free
do
user
you,
monetization
so
and
how do you guys break down your 10 to 90?
I actually don't have those numbers ready for you because we have some internal disagreement at Futuresearch. But I
Or
will say that we
do you
are in
have
agreement.
a new products bucket, I guess.
Yes, they had this thing called new product, which I think they mean ads. It generally means ads,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
how exactly that would work, I'm still quite skeptical of.
yeah.
The one thing that we all agree at Futuresearch is that if it is something on the higher end of this range, something like 90 billion by 2027, or even 60, I would say, I expect it will be at least one third of that will be via agents. And that's, I think, quite a strong claim because they basically don't make any money with agents right now. I mean, unless you consider deep research to be an agent, and it's not very good. The kind of people using, the idea that OpenAI say launches a product specifically for software automation, and it's kind of a coding agent that you could buy. They would have to do that and then ramp that up to billions of revenue within 1 to 2 to 3 years, and that would be unbelievably fast. But if it is the case that they're making that kind of revenue, I do think it will be from a new agent business that they have yet to release, or maybe something from operator, computer usage, being able to kind of move the mouse around and click and type stuff, like trying to automate white collar work, not just in coding, not just in software engineering, not just in customer service either, but more, your work, quant work could be maybe automated by operator.
Is
It's not really a product yet, but it could happen.
Then is there a scenario where they hit the higher end of your estimate, your
Mhm.
confidence interval, without being head and shoulders above on the foundation models? In other words, their models are not not clearly the best, maybe not the best, but somehow they found revenue anyway. Is there a scenario where that happens? The higher end.
Yeah, I think that's a semantic question. It depends what you mean by foundational model. One thing that I think
Well, one of their models is just so good that we all drop using the other models. That would be what I mean. Is that a requirement for them to hit the higher end of your 90 billion confidence interval?
Yeah, I would generally say yes, but with the asterisk that again, it's not clear exactly what that means. I think, for example, we don't know what O3 is. When O1 came out, they were very clear. This is, reinforcement learning on chain of thought. It's producing, the next tool call, the next thing it's going to do, and it's kind of iterating through that process. When you use O3, it's clear that it's saying, now I want to search for this. Now I want to read this. Now that I know this, now what I want to search for is this. Then I want to read this. Okay, now I have to do some number crunching. So I'm going to write some Python code. It very much looks like the reinforcement learning of chain of thought. But what is the underlying model that was reinforcement learned to produce O3? It's possible this is known, but I don't know what the answer to that question is. So let's say that O3 really is better than Gemini 2.5 Pro. Let's say it really is the best model out there. Is that the best foundation model? Is that the best model? Or is it some sort of kind of agentic thing that they put on top of it that is actually the thing that's best? You
Yeah, yeah,
described
but that's what I'm saying is that uh, there's a possibility they have a breakthrough on the architecture front, or they just have a breakthrough on other things like integration or something else, right? So
yeah.
orchestration. But on the architecture front, I'm a bit skeptical because, as you know, we live here in San Francisco Bay Area. It's not like the people who work in these companies don't go back and forth and go to the same parties
That's
and
right.
maybe even live in the same hacker houses, right? So I guess
Yep.
there might be secret sauces, but I don't know if there's a real secret sauce out there, right? So
I would agree with that. And also, I mean, the number of great researchers who have left OpenAI in order
oh
to
yeah,
directly
that
compete with it is there's probably more talent exodus from OpenAI to direct competitors than any tech company in modern history.
yeah. I mean, that's the other thing that we haven't talked about is just their bleeding talent, right?
Yeah, I think that is an underrated problem. I completely agree with you, Ben. I will say, yes, it's possible there's some algorithmic breakthrough that only
By the way,
OpenAI.
before we go in here, do you guys track that? Do you go on LinkedIn and scrape LinkedIn and say and look at movement, employee
Uh,
movement?
Futuresearch has actually run some web agents to do exactly that, to just kind of track down where all the researchers who worked at OpenAI have gone. We actually compiled a list of all of the key departures in OpenAI over the last couple of years and kind of classified them by where they went and how senior they were.
And give me a top line, man.
Um, I think I'd have to make a bunch of loud keyboard noises on this podcast in order to find that for you, but maybe I'll send it to you afterwards and
Yeah,
you can share it with your readers in your
But
newsletter.
what do you remember?
Um, Gosh, I mean, I could list various names which I think are already well known.
No, but yeah, not just names, but is there a pattern of where they went?
Oh yeah, no, they're absolutely like most of them went to compete directly with OpenAI. They went to XAI. A lot of them went to Anthropic. You know, safe superintelligence from Ilya,
Yep.
Mira Murati's new thing. Yeah, I mean, most of them who have left are now directly competing.
Did Google and Meta get people?
I
Not as
think
much.
Google got a few. Meta, I think, got none. From what I hear, Meta is actually bleeding their own AI talent for unrelated reasons.
I can tell you later why.
Yeah, okay, great. I'd love to hear that.
After we stop recording. But okay, so
Sure.
we're talking about, this notion that maybe they don't have a secret sauce on architecture, but where will the secret sauce come from?
Yeah, I do have a story for that. And again, if your listeners want to engage with this more, highly recommend AI2027.com, AI-2027, or just Google it. It lays out a very detailed story about where this comes from. And it's kind of prosaic, but I think it is profound. Basically, step one is that you automate most of the rest of the software engineering that is needed inside a frontier lab. So, automating all of software engineering is something people talk about all the time, but automating just the software engineering that is done by the research engineers within OpenAI and focusing on that could actually be done even within a few years.
Yeah,
Once you have kind of armies of coders.
This could entail mundane things like DevOps and
I think it's especially the mundane
spinning
things.
up clusters and
Exactly. It's basically all of the work other than, what the researchers call ideation, right? Basically, not what is the next experiment, but once you have the next experiment, basically coding it up, all the parameters, securing the compute, like running it all, analyzing all the results. If that stuff could be done 10 times faster, then all the researchers there could be spending all of their time just coming up with new ideas. Even Zuckerberg on his recent podcast said that AI is giving them so many different product suggestions that they don't even have enough time to implement them because they're getting coded up so quickly. That is something that could lead to the researchers who work at OpenAI suddenly finding themselves, say, 3 times more productive, and the speed of the research going on there being, say, 3 times faster. If somebody, again, it may not be OpenAI that achieves this, but if any frontier AI lab can automate so much of the work of their kind of feedback loop of doing research and trying new ideas to speed up, they could get an advantage. They could then be a positive feedback loop. They could then use that advantage in the automation of their own research to get even faster and faster. And when you have dynamics that are positive feedback loops, that's a place where you could have a winner takes all. That's where one company could get so far ahead that other companies that previously were only a few months behind suddenly find themselves a few years behind, and then suddenly they can never catch up again. Again, it doesn't have to be OpenAI. This could be Google DeepMind that achieves this. It even could be Meta, could be Microsoft, could be Anthropic, could be X, but it could be OpenAI. And I think that's the path towards a kind of insurmountable monopolistic advantage. And I think they're working on this explicitly.
So let's go back to recent history. Like
Sure.
you said, right? So the time to reach 100 billion. Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Facebook, ByteDance, OpenAI, and now potentially OpenAI, right? So, like you said, a lot of these companies aside from OpenAI, they focused. They basically blitzscaled and dominated one category.
That's right.
And now, arguably, you can say the same thing, right? Let's take Google, right? So when Google first came on the scene, I think you're a bit too young, but I remember when Google first came to the scene, people.
I remember. Yeah.
We were like going, well, is this really better than Inktomi or Alta Vista? Or it was clearly better, but then not clear that they could have maintained their lead because people started using the same ideas, right? So, but then they found a business model. They had this ad auction model that was second to none.
That's right.
And obviously they had the technical chops from the beginning, right? So Google invented so many things, MapReduce, right? So distributed file system, Bigtable, and all sorts of things.
And modern cloud computing, I would say, the first to massively scale up their data centers. For years in 2003, 4, 5, nobody knew just how giant Google's data centers had gotten and just how many servers they had shoved in there. It was a closely guarded secret at Google before Microsoft eventually found out what was going on. By the time of the Facebook era, it was clear that scaling vast amounts of compute in data centers could give you this huge advantage. But Google was one of the first to figure that out, and that gave them like a massive, massive edge.
So the question is, can someone uh, grow into one of these companies without having that focus, right? So as we discussed,
Yep.
OpenAI is now talking about ChatGPT. Well, we're both skeptical that ChatGPT will be that path, right? For the reasons we described, right? So agents, well, agents, it's not clear that that do they really have something that no one else has, right? So they have this new revenue sources, which you alluded to, which might be ads, right?
Yep.
So is it possible to get into this 100 billion family of companies without being dominant in any one thing?
I definitely think no. They have to be dominant in something. But maybe, again, to kind of give the Steelman version, the bull case. Imagine you're Google and it's the year 2002. You've built this great search engine. People totally love it. I mean, really, they were in a position that is very similar to OpenAI today, where many, many millions of users on the free tier of ChatGPT. It has great brand awareness. People have really like it. When a lot of people, when they think of AI, they just think of ChatGPT. They don't even know what GPT stands for, but they think of ChatGPT when they think of AI. But in 2002, Google was still struggling. They were poor. Microsoft was the big behemoth that they were absolutely terrified of. Even Yahoo was huge compared to Google. Like Yahoo had more revenue, Yahoo had everything. But then Google was able to not only extend their technical lead, but build one of the greatest business models of all time in their ad auctions, exactly as you described, Ben. From the perspective of 2002, you could have looked at Google and said, well, is this going to be the fastest growing company of all time? And you would have said, they have some advantages, but they're going to have to invent something. Like what they currently have is not going to take them to 100 billion in revenue or even 10 billion or 1 billion. But they did, figure out how to build an ad system on top of their search engine in a way that just absolutely put to shame the kind of display ads that Yahoo was using. I mean, it was a qualitative shift.
And they made one of the all-time best acquisitions, YouTube.
Yeah, but and not just that one though, but I mean, Google Maps and Android and
Everything that kind of fit into that whole ecosystem around information discovery, right?
Yeah. So in that sense, Google was quite focused. Their mission of organizing the world's information. I mean, Larry Page was driving around a car taking pictures. Like he was trying to scan every book in the library near where he lived. I mean, he really was just trying to basically become the information broker. And that absolutely worked out for them. What is the equivalent story for ChatGPT? I don't think it's one of these old stories. I don't think it's search ads. I don't think it's social. I can believe in agents. We talked about agents.
And then the subscription model, I think, will be under pressure very quickly. Right.
It's already under huge pressure. I mean, I'm amazed that they're doing as well as they're doing now. I think a lot of people just haven't learned how good the alternatives are, but eventually people will pay. People will vote with their wallet.
And just between us, and of course, all the people listening to this podcast, they do have this. They have this thing where they also want to get in front of their competition as far as marketing, right? So
Yes.
like Google, you have a conference, we'll pre-announce a model.
Yep.
OpenAI on the same week, right? So they are cognizant of the fact that a lot of their success depends on their being perceived as being ahead of the competition. The problem for them is that the people who are building, because this is still, at this point at least, still a battle for the hearts and minds of developers.
Yep.
Developers are aware that actually a lot of these models are swappable.
Yes.
Right? So
I think consumers will learn the same thing, and enterprise customers will learn the same thing. I mean, enterprise obviously has more lock-in than consumer, but it's not insurmountable. Like enterprises will finish out their contracts and switch if something is better and cheaper.
And it's not lost on me and many people that the most vocal naysayers and kind of really the most vocal people using scaremongering tactics against the Chinese open weights models are OpenAI and Anthropic, right? So.
Yeah, I'm not particularly well informed in that, other than the evals that we've done of DeepSeek. But suffice to say,
Well, no. I mean, set aside let's say, for example, they accept the fact that these models are as good as them, but then now they're talking about, these weights are security risk and this and that. I mean, so I've actually just done a deep dive on this, right? So because I just was at RSA, I started talking to security people. And honestly, open weights models in general have this problem that there's derivative models, right? So when you have
Right.
derivative models, you don't know the provenance and security and all of that, right? So,
That's
but
right.
assuming that you get one of these open weights models and you really put it through its paces, scan it, and make sure that you're comfortable deploying it, I don't think there's any security risks from the weights, right? So, but if you're using the API in China, yeah, that's a different thing, right? So they'll
Right.
they'll
Right.
they'll send your data to the Communist Party. But if you're deploying it on Amazon or Azure, you're using the DeepSeek version on Amazon or Azure. I'm assuming Amazon and Azure did the scanning and additional red teaming and alignment to make that model ready to deploy. I think it's fine. So, but then you hear the Anthropic and OpenAI people just really kind of saying all sorts of crazy things about these Chinese open weights models. It's not lost on me that
Yeah. No,
the,
that's a
the, the
perception.
big the big companies don't seem to be Meta and Google don't seem to be that perturbed about it, right? So
Well, an interesting addition to that is Apple, because this is another case where I was happy that Futuresearch was ahead of the curve. Apple announced at WWDC last year that they were going to integrate ChatGPT into Siri. Do you remember this?
yes, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, right when that actually days before that announcement came out, we were forecasting whether that would work because there were rumors of it. And our conclusion was that Apple, even with its secure enclave, its kind of data centers full of these Mac minis, that there was no reasonable way that they were going to be able to run GPT-4, like a proprietary OpenAI model at scale and serve it to Siri users. And also, there was no way that anything like GPT-4 was ever going to fit on an iPhone. But they announced it anyway, and it's been 9, 10 months since then. There's no ChatGPT in Siri at all. That could have been a great way for OpenAI to get some sort of user lock-ins, something that would prevent their users from switching away to another chat service. But they were unable to do it. I don't know if that had anything to do with the secure enclaves, whether it was being able to run GPT-4 without giving iPhone users data away to OpenAI. I think there are technical solutions to that problem. So I think it failed for some other reason. But still, that was a chance for them to kind of provide their model and a new distribution network on a place where they would reach people all over the world. And it kind of fell apart. If that had happened, I think their ChatGPT numbers would be much higher, and I would be much more confident about their predictions that they can grow to 50 billion in revenue with ChatGPT alone.
By the way, also this is historically speaking, this is an example where someone is getting to 100, trying to get to 100 billion in revenue in a category where there's a lot of people already there competing with them.
That's right.
And not only that, that are just as intensely interested in that category as they are.
Yeah, I mean, then to your point about whenever Google DeepMind releases something, OpenAI tries to kind of scoop them or release something bigger on the same day. The fact that that's even happening is an example of how competitive it is. Because you would not imagine that, if Google was releasing a search feature in 2003, or if Facebook was releasing something on the news feed in 2008, that, MySpace would be jumping to release something similar, or Yahoo would be trying to compete with Google. When those guys released something big, they were the only game in town and they knew it. Like, they had absolutely dominant networks and no one was paying attention to any of their competitors. The fact that people even think that much about their competitors, it's just in the minds of people who are going to open their wallets and decide who they're going to pay for AI services. It's just so obvious that there are so many competitors. And yeah, when Microsoft Office would announce something in 1994, or some sort of Windows update, no one was thinking like, oh, well, I'll just get a Macintosh. I mean, they had such incredible lock-in, like they stole the show. And it just doesn't feel that way. It doesn't feel like the world of Microsoft or Google or Facebook's dominance.
So is it fair for me to be more bearish about Anthropic?
I think I'm biased here because I know people at Anthropic and I think they're brilliant.
So, man, you can't be biased. You're supposed to be objective, man.
I know, as I'm saying, it's difficult for me to be objective about them. Also, when we switched
I mean,
most
what is it?
Futuresearch,
85% of their revenue is from AWS API, right?
85%. Oh, I didn't know that. I knew it was a
Something
lot.
like that, So, but
Yeah.
most of the revenue is API. And then most of it is AWS.
Yeah, I mean, we're spending many thousands a month on Claude, and yeah, we use AWS, but also the Anthropic API directly.
And then
Yeah, their models are
yeah,
great.
Replicate also serves up their models, right? So,
Yeah, so
yeah, so I mean, so they're more API dependent. API to me is a race to the bottom.
I agree. I agree
So
with that.
tell me why I shouldn't be more bearish about Anthropic.
Uh, it's interesting. You know, Sam Altman used to talk a lot about superintelligence when he talked about OpenAI, and he very much has been conspicuously not doing that recently. Whereas Dario Amodei of Anthropic is still basically saying we are expecting superintelligence in the next couple of years. Anthropic, I think, is thinking less about the business and is thinking more about the tech. You know, they work a lot on interpretability. They work on like trying to understand and like tweak the internals of their models. I think they have more people working on that than anybody. Now, that might be a dead end as a research direction. It might just be, you know, giant black box models. So it's just all that we're ever going to get. But if these guys can actually do the kind of internal surgery on these models and can kind of learn some of the fundamentals about why they're so smart, that certainly no AI researcher has a really good understanding of why these models are as good as they are. They could maybe find they might be the most likely to find some sort of technical breakthrough out of any of the frontier labs because they spend so much time on the core like nuts and bolts. I know DeepMind is doing this. I know OpenAI is doing this. Maybe XAI is not doing this. I'm not sure. But Anthropic is really making a huge, huge bet on interpretability and like the mutability of these models and aligning them too. Don't forget, one of the things that can happen here is that an OpenAI or Google DeepMind model could do something so heinous that their users leave them in droves. Like if they start cyber attacks or they start scamming their users or things like that. You know, these AIs are not aligned by default, and we're seeing more and more examples of them doing things that their users don't actually want. If it turns out that a model being safe and reliable and trustworthy is actually a really, really critical feature, Anthropic might win on that dimension. But these are not really business lock-in stories. They're not
Yeah, yeah,
stories
yeah.
that
But
probably,
still, you know, it's an apples to apples. OpenAI versus Anthropic. One is more revenue diversified than the other, right?
yeah, well, I mean, OpenAI is valued at 260 billion, and Anthropic is valued at 60 billion. So it's a 4.5 to 1 ratio
They
there.
have, I mean, they both have the same problem in that they have to continuously raise money just to keep up with the costs
That's
of
right.
that expensive headcount, inference costs, training costs, R&D costs, right?
Yep.
And
Although one thing is, OpenAI has to pay researchers a lot of money to work for them these days. And a lot of the most brilliant researchers prefer to work at Anthropic. And this is one of those cases where it might turn out that, who had the right brilliant people at the right place will turn out to be the deciding factor. And if that is the deciding factor, it might be Anthropic or maybe DeepMind who are really able to get those very best researchers. Or I mean, it could be safe super intelligence from Ilya. But in terms of just quality of researchers, I think I would bet on Anthropic.
at this point,
Yes, yeah. Well, mostly because they have a lot of great people who left Google and left OpenAI. I know people like great people who left both companies to go work at Anthropic, and I don't see anybody going the other direction. But also for the next time a brilliant grad of some CS PhD program or somebody figures something out wants to get a job, I think there'd be a real chance that if they got offers from all the frontier labs, they would choose Anthropic, and that is a very, very big advantage. Now, I have no data to back that. I just have anecdotes. But if that is in fact true, that could turn out to be a decisive advantage.
and just in case my friend Mark Chen, head of research at OpenAI, is listening, I'm not exactly agreeing with what Dan just said there, Mark. And
It's anecdotal. Yeah.
and with that, thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Ben, very much for having me.